Okay, recording. Introduction. Okay, did somebody say something? Okay, I will now start. I just want to make to clear something. I'm in Innsbruck. I was for 2 years at the same time also in Vienna, and had this professor for contemporary society. But from 2013, I am professor for Islamic religious education here in Innsbruck, and I founded this institute here, not the one in Vienna. There is the Professor Adnan Aslan. It's not a big deal, but I just wanted to clear that. Thank you for the invitation.
Apologies are due.
No problem. It's not wrong. I was there, and I was the lead. I had the lead of department, but now I'm just in Innsbruck because I saw in the last 2 years it's not easy to manage 2 institutes who are 500 kilometers abroad from each other. Okay, so I am firstly, thank you for the invitation. Unfortunately, I couldn't send you a document to prepare for the conference, but I still hope that my presentation today can give you a brief overview of over my contribution. I just have always little problems when I have to speak in English because I use it once or twice in a year sometimes. So I will read that what I want to say today, and I want to point out again, these are the ideas that I want to present today, which will be a part of the chapter for the book. To begin with, I would like to briefly introduce my intention for today. I said it, the presentation is designed to provide information of the thematic structure, sources used, and conceptual orientation of my book chapter on the concept of education in Islam. It should give an overall picture of the contribution and allow to give feedback. The book chapter, so sometimes I will say book chapter and sometimes my presentation today, but I hope it makes sense for you, is divided or will be divided in 6 sections. The first, let me try with my, the first one is a general introduction to the topic. The second section deals with the foundations of education in Islam. On the one hand, it deals with the theological, and at the other hand, with the philosophical sources. The third section deals with the historical development of education in Islam, in addition to various processes, important personalities, and institutions that have played a significant role in the history of Islamic education are presented in this section. The fourth section analyzes different understandings of education within Islamic current. The fourth of these sections is on Sufism and a little bit about Shiism, but I will still explain why these two and maybe some others also, in which the question of educational process enjoys a central position. I mean, when we talk about education in Islam, I think Sufism, Tasawwuf, or Islamic mysticism has a large contribution to the education. In the fifth and penetral section, the focus is on current approaches and concepts of Islamic education, which are stringent in the course of the modernization and the reform movements, and are now also controversially discussed in the European context due to the establishment of the Islamic theology. As you know, probably in the last 10 years, we have there are approximately 10 or 8 Islamic centers in European universities. So we have also a discussion about that, which understanding of education we should have in a European context. And the paper concludes with a discussion on the possible contribution of Islamic education to interreligious understanding. It's very wide. The question is explored to what extent Islamic education can contribute to the cultivation of an appreciative attitude toward ideological, we call here it weltanschaulich. I don't know whether we can say it in German, ideologische, but in English, and religious diversity. So I will start with the introduction, and you have some points of that what I will read now. At the growing glory of growing glory of creation, human beings play a central role within Islam. It's a little bit from the anthropology of Islam. In accordance with his abilities, he is called upon to live up to the responsibility on earth entrusted to him by God. We have the concept of Khalifa and so on, but I'm not going to these points here in the presentation, because if I would mention all these points, what I hope to present in the chapter, it would be too much for these 20 or 30 minutes. This includes cultivating a way of dealing with oneself, one's surroundings, and one's environment that is in line with one's nature. We have also here the concept of fitra, of the human being. In this way, human beings bear a special responsibility for the world that has been placed in their hands by God. However, human beings are complex and ambivalent creatures. Through their reason and will, they have the freedom to accept this role and to act accordingly or reject it. Consequently, they are able to educate themselves either in the sense of the creator or against him. Because of this given ambivalent nature of human beings, which distinguishes them from other living beings, the education and upbringing of human beings, as in all religions, is given a special place in Islam. For as being capable of education and dependent on education, which is in a continuous process of spiritual development, it requires adequate accompaniment in order to reach the necessary stages of development one after the other. Accompanying this process of development, unfolding or becoming a human being and enabling human beings to continuously unfold spiritually is one of the most important goals of religion. Therefore, the assumption, it can be said without exaggerating, that the main goal of religions, and thus also of Islam, is to educate people according to their own ideas and in harmony with the human condition, so that they are able to cope with themselves, their environment, and their surroundings. Let us look a little bit the theological and philosophical foundations. As we all know, Islam has several sources from which its teaching are derived, although these sources are interpreted differently depending on the view of the observer. There is a broad consensus among scholars about the number and order of these sources. I mean, it's something important not just for the Islamic education or the education in Islam, but also for other disciplines in Islam. As in all Islamic disciplines, the Quran as the word of God and the Sunnah as the way of life of the Messenger Muhammad are of central importance for Islamic education, or for the concept of education in Islam. They form a framework and the basis of education in Islam. The principles, content, and ends, as well as the practical and religious character of education in Islam, are fundamentally affected by statements from the Quran and the prophetic tradition. In order to determine the importance of education in Quran and Sunnah and their possible influence on the Muslim community, Quranic passages and tradition of the Messenger Muhammad will be presented in the book chapter, but here I will present just one or two verses. For reasons of time, this presentation will refrain from a detailed presentation of the Quran and the tradition. But in the article, that I will complete in the next months, inshallah, structure and composites of these sources will be presented in detail, as this knowledge is necessary to understand the differences between various Islamic concepts. I mean, if we don't explain in an article how Quran, I mean, how the structure of Quran is, it's not so easy to understand why we have different concepts of Islamic education in the Islamic world. Another important aspect that will be discussed more detailed in the conceptual explication in the chapter. In doing so, the central terms and concepts of Islamic education will be explained and related to current pedagogical concepts. For example, we have here this concept of this term of ta'aleem, tarbiyah, and ta'deeb. And we have now in Europe the discussion, can we translate this in German? I mean, I'm speaking about German because our discussions are now, but surely there are discussions also in English-speaking areas. So what term in German means ta'aleem? Is it Bildung? Is it Lernen or something else? Tarbiyah and ta'deeb. I have some definitions, but I will not read them because even between the Islamic scholars, there are very different opinions about what ta'aleem means. Is ta'aleem meaning just learning something or bringing information to somebody else? And what means tarbiyah and what means ta'deeb? But in the article, I will try to explain them and to give all these different views, why somebody thinks that educations mean ta'aleem and why somebody means that adequate translation is tarbiyah, and it could be also tazkiyah. It is something what we can borrow from the Islamic Sufism. But that's one point that I will refer in the article, so to see how these terms can be translated and understood in English. Now I turn back to Quran and to Sunnah. The most important indication of Islam's special affection for education is seen above all in the beginning of the Quranic revelation. The first Quranic verses, which were sent down to the Messenger Muhammad, begin with the Arabic word Iqra, which is translated into German lies, rezitiere, as reading or recitating, among these things. So let us see what the surah, the chapter 96, verse 1 and 5 says. Read in the name of the sustainer who has created man out of a germ cell. Read, for the sustainer is the most bountiful, one who was taught the use of the pen, taught man what he didn't know. Even though the first verses have different interpretation, I mean, there are many interpretations about that, what it means read, what should the Prophet do when he was asked to read. Muslim community or Muslims have understood these verses from the beginning as God's call for education in the broadest sense. And thus in the Islamic tradition, the first verses, especially the first word, have established themselves as a symbol of the divine call for education. I mean, you have much of TV channels or some other things that, or schools, private school, they call themselves Iqra in according to this divine call for education. Another important Quranic verse that underlines the relevance of education in Islam is found in Surah 39:9. So here is the prominent verse: "Qul hal yastawi alladhina ya'lamuna walladhina la ya'lamun." It's something sometimes for me easier to say it in Arabic than in English. Can they who know and they who don't know be deemed equal? Only they who are endowed with the insight keep this in mind. But as I mentioned before, there are some Quranic verses. There are a lot of Quranic verses, but I will mentioned these verses when in the chapter of the book, but now I thought that two verses would be enough for the presentation. But we also have some hadith, some ahadith, some traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. An important hadith that has not only achieved great fame, but has also been a strong impetus for the promotion of education among Muslims, is that tradition in which the pursuit of knowledge is declared to be a religious obligation, a fard for every Muslim. Another tradition in which Muslims are urged to seek knowledge, even when it is in China, allows the scope of knowledge to be acquired, to extend to that non-religious knowledge as well, because there is always a discussion in the Islamic educational history. So which knowledge does the sources mean when they mean about ilm? Is the meaning about ilm to learn just theological and religious knowledge, or does it mean to learn everything in a broad perspective? How natural education has been regarded in the prophetic tradition is also shown, for example, by the statement that says, the wise sayings is the lost property of the believer. So wherever he finds it, then he has a right to it or to take it. There are many such prophetic traditions also in Tirmidhi. In addition to the theological aspects, the article also deals with the philosophical foundations of education in Islam. It is primarily concerned with the reflection of Muslim scholars who do not refer exclusively to religious sources, but also justify their educational view philosophically and with rational arguments. Thus, this contribution is based on a broad understanding of philosophy, which does not only include those persons who are explicitly known as philosophers. Rather, it is about various personalities of Islamic scholarship who have commented on the topic of education in their works. For example, we have some names that are in the Islamic education famous for their writings in the field of Islamic education. We have Abu Hanifa. They are not Islamic educators. Not all are philosophers, but they have writings who concern education. We have Al-Jahiz, Al-Zarnuji, we have Ibn Sahnun, Ibn Jama'a. We have also the philosophers Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, and Ibn Rushd. So these names will also be part of when we speak about the theological and the philosophical foundations of education in Islam. So these persons that I mentioned here will also, not the persons, but their works in field of education will also be analyzed in this part. Now we have an historical development as the third part. The roots of Islamic education can be traced back to the Messenger Muhammad. He is considered the first teacher who delivered, explained, and commented on the divine message from the beginning. His goal was to win people over the message of God in order to initiate certain personal and social changes. Therefore, the historical development of education in Islam must inevitably be traced back to Prophet Muhammad. Educational activities of Messenger Muhammad can be divided, they must be divided in the Meccan and Medinian period. In Mecca, before the immigration to Medina, when the Muslim community was small and weak, there were no special places of education. I mean, if we look at the literature, we have that information that the Prophet Muhammad met with his companions in the house of Arqam, Darul Arqam, to learn the revelation and the new teachings. In Medina, the situation of a Muslim changed completely, so that with the first mosque that was built there in Medina, first educational institutions were also founded. Starting with the mosque as the first educational institution of Muslims, we have further places of education in Islam that will be presented in this chapter. This includes the Kutab. This is also institution of education at that time, but it was mainly for the elementary school, as elementary school, and the madrasa as the institution of higher education, which played an important role in Islamic education until the 20th century. In this section, the main aim will be to present the special features of these places of education on the one hand, and to show the reasons, the structure, but also their contribution to Islamic education on other. As the first step toward the institutionalization of education in the Islamic Middle Age, the madrasa will be discussed in detail. The reason for the emergence of the important educational institution, as well as their influence of Islamic education, are discussed. What content was taught in these educational institutions, how they differed from each other, and what reason led to the decline of these important educational institutions are further topics covered in this section. So that the connection can be made in the later section between current concepts. We said that we speak also about current concepts of Islamic education or education in Islam and approaches in Islamic education with historical developments. Reformatory approaches in the Ottoman Empire are also briefly explained or will be explained. Because the reform efforts in the Ottoman Empire of the 18th and 19th century are of particular importance because they have a far-reaching influence that can also be felt in the present. I mean, it's for me very important when we speak about education in Islam to mention also this period in the Ottoman Empire, because that's my feeling, but we can discuss it after my presentation, that when we speak about some reformation in Islam, mostly our colleagues, when they speak about it, they forget that these efforts started not now in Europe or for 10 years, but we have a long history of 200 and 250 years of dealing with the reforms in education, but also in the other fields in Islam. We said there will be also a part about different Islamic schools and movements. As you all know, Islam is as diverse as all other religion traditions. Therefore, it is difficult to speak of Islamic concept of education. Indeed, there are a multitude of different understandings of what is meant by Islamic education, or how education should be understood in Islam, because there are different approaches what education is, and there are different approaches what Islam is. Due to abundance of different approaches and the fact that this article is written from a Sunni perspective, I've tried to take all perspectives, but I have a Sunni perspective. I would like also to mention a little bit in the book, the Shi'i perspective should be briefly discussed in this section. In addition, it seems to make sense to deal specifically with the understanding of education in Islamic Sufism or in mysticism. This is because Islamic mysticism is the major Islamic tradition dealing with education in general and religious education in particular. They had a major concept of education that clearly defined both the goal and the methods necessary to achieve them. It should be noted, of course, that Islamic mysticism does not form a monolithic block either, like Islam, also not. And there are different approaches within Sufism that differ from each other. Now, nevertheless, it is undisputed that Islamic mysticism, with its educational concept, is an important part of Islamic educational history, and therefore deserves to be discussed in this paper. So I will mention there also some Sufi scholars who have their own concept of what education should be from the Islamic perspective. So let us look a little bit about what I plan to write in the current, under the title Current Discussions. This section of the paper deals with current approaches, discourses, and challenges in Islamic education. Since the reform approaches in Islamic education cannot be separated from the general reform movements of the 19th century, these reform approaches are briefly presented. So crucial of these are Muslim scholars, for example, like Jamaluddin Afghani, who is one of the pioneers of the Muslim reform movements of the 19th century. So in this part, I will deal a little bit with this and then try to explain the current discussions in Islamic education. The backwardness of the Muslim world vis-a-vis the West in almost all areas became particularly visible in the 19th century. This posed a great challenge to the Muslims to identify the reason for this situation. The question arose as to how it could be that the Muslim community, which had been the center of scientific and cultural progress for centuries, had been ruined to such an extent that it was unable to keep up with the West. Despite different views, and we have different views about how it happened and why it happened, most Muslim scholars were quick to agree that the most important reason for the decline of the Muslim empire and within it is its scientific and cultural superiority was the outdated education system that did not meet the needs of the present. The missed educational reforms, the separation of religious and non-religious knowledge in favor of religious knowledge in the educational institutions were for the scholars the most important reason why Muslim countries were colonized on the one hand and unable to keep up with Western countries on the other. Therefore, the reform movements initiated about 200 years ago were also taken up in the 20th century. Important Muslim scholars of the 20th century also dealt with the question of the concept of Islamic education. This paper will present two important concepts that differ from each other in many ways, because there are many concepts that are developed in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in India. Sometimes because we live in Europe, I studied in an Arabic country and I studied also in Turkey. So we see only these regions, but there are also different regions who had their own reforms, local reforms. But I took two persons that maybe are, they have a global place in these reform movements. In one hand, it's Fazlur Rahman, a professor in Chicago University, who was a professor in Chicago University, has an approach to education should be explained in the book chapter. And in another, on another hand, it's Al-Attas, a Malaysian scholar who also has a big impact on education. The ideas of Fazlur Rahman are have enormous importance in this context because he was worked out an overall concept of the necessary reforms in Islam, which also included education. I mean, he was not the educator, but he had a global idea about reforms in Islam, and he wrote also something about education. Attas, on the other hand, is an important representative of such called Islamization of knowledge, a little bit in Malaysia and Pakistan, and an influential intellectual of the 20th century who was in charge of drafting the Declaration of Mecca 1979, which deals with education in Islam in the 20th century. So I will present them as in the book chapter and look a little bit, analyze their concepts and which approach they have to education from a Muslim perspective. In addition to these central concepts of the 20th century, this section will also deal with current approaches to educational theory, which have emerged in European context and naturally in close cooperation with the Christian religion. I mean, that is happening now in Germany, is then the focus of this last part. On the one hand, the challenges of Islamic education in European context, and on the other hand, the innovative character of the new approaches will be explored. The following questions are central for this last part. What distinguishes Islamic education or Islamic concept of education in the current European context? What are the central concepts of Islamic education in Europe, and which challenges stand out in particular in a European context? Through these questions, a broad area is covered. I hope so. Above all, interreligious cooperation plays an important role in the question of existing and future challenges, because on the one hand, Christian theology has played an important role in establishing Islamic theology and religious education in German-speaking universities. On the other hand, there are a number of social challenges that can only be overcome through close cooperation, which brings us to the last section, which is about the possible interreligious contribution of Islamic education or Islamic concept of education. It was also a problem for me, the difference between Islamic education and the concept of education in Islam, but I hope that I can make a combination between these two. So we come, did I forget something? No. To the last part. Okay, I'm on time, I think, I hope, or yes. There will last 2 minutes, I hope. The interreligious contribution or the possible contribution, interreligious contribution of Islamic education. Interreligious cooperation with a special focus on religious education is inevitable in today's religious plural society. There are several reasons for this. On the one hand, interreligious cooperation is necessary to promote peaceful coexistence in a pluralistic society. For this, the cultivation of an appreciative attitude toward diversity, ambivalence, and ambiguity, which entails contingency sensitivity, is indispensable. Contingency sensitivity is understood in this context to mean that something could be or could have been different from that what it is. On the other hand, religions are challenged upon to position themselves in a post-secular society in such a way that their positive contribution to peaceful and respectful coexistence becomes visible. This affects religious education at schools in particular, as a Religionsunterricht, which is offered on a denominational basis in Germany, in Austria. We have always the question when we talk about religious education. I don't know how it is in Germany, but in Austria, the first question is, why do we need religious education at schools? And why should we pay taxes for religious education that is dividing the people and not bringing them together? And the alternative for that is always the ethic education at the school. So that's also a big point in when we speak about interreligious cooperation. Another argument in favor of interreligious cooperation in religious education are the common roots of the monotheistic religions in particular. I mean, I'm a pluralist in religious education, and generally, I think all religions have common roots, some common roots, but I mention here only the monotheistic because they mention themselves that they have the common roots. Based on this state of affairs, this section explores the question of how a pluralistic attitude can be justified in Islamic education and what contribution this can make to interreligious understanding. For this purpose, various Islamic approaches to the pluralistic theology of religions will be discussed in the finished paper, I hope. So I hope, despite all my English mistakes and readings, that you have an overview about what I have, what I did plan for the chapter in this book. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward for your feedback. Thank you.